Hi, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of Some Drivel, a series of podcasts exploring tangents with awesome humans. And speaking of awesome humans, I am joined today by an absolutely outstanding actor, John Billingsley, who you may recognize most famously from Star Trek Enterprise, but with a career that spans decades of guest starring roles across theatre, film, and TV. John, thank you so much for giving up your time, man. We are so grateful to have you here, and I can't wait for us to dive in.
I am delighted to have been invited. I am a master of drivel. And I also want to recommend a book that I've been reading recently,
Oh,
which is,
yes.
um, and now I thought I knew everything about how to take a bath. But when I read this book, it turns out that there were many aspects of bathing that had completely gone
They've
over my
eluded
head.
you.
Yeah, the book does not have an author, which I think is really kind of, it's shocking. I mean,
Yeah, somewhat
somebody
mysterious as well.
heart and soul into this book, and yet there is no authorial attribution. Yes, it's from Smart Kids Media. It actually has a sound function, but it's broken. Presumably, this would be like gurgling sounds and
That was
this.
not the arc of that introduction that I was expecting.
I know. Yeah, but 9.95 will get you. Um,
Well, I mean, look, John, you've helped me beautifully with my segue there. Let's address it. Clearly,
yeah,
your backdrop putting my small collection of books to shame. Clearly, literature a big thing for you. Talk me through that. Where is that? Where does that passion come
I'm a
from? And
lunatic, is what it is. I'm a
okay,
lunatic. There are any number of things that you can become addicted to in life. You can become addicted to gambling, loose women. Bonnie made sure that that was out. Drugs, booze. I am addicted to books. I love to read. I wanted to be a librarian when I was a kid.
oh
And
wow, okay.
so I've indulged myself my whole life by buying more books than I could read if I did nothing but read and lived to 1,000 years old. But I like to choose. And also, if you're surrounded by books, they yell at you. And so you are less inclined to watch television and more inclined to read. Hey, what about me?
100%.
You've had me for 30 years. I'm
Yeah.
back here moldering.
I'm collecting dust, pal.
Yeah,
Let's do
exactly.
this. Well,
Exactly.
that's interesting you say because it's a big push in my sort of day job, my career as a teacher. There's a big push right now, certainly in national English education, around reading for pleasure, reading for fun, not just because you're, given a set text for a GCSE exam, but you're actually attacking a book because you simply want to be immersed in great storytelling. And I think
Yeah.
anything like that, particularly with young people, where
It,
apathy is the
it, it,
great challenge, right? And
It is, and I say this realizing I'm speaking to a teacher, and I certainly understand the necessity of actually
Mhm.
teaching kids specific shit. But if it were me, thank God it isn't. If it were me and I could rule the world, I personally am of the mind that you lock kids in a room for 2 hours and you fill the place with things to read.
Mhm.
And I don't care what they read, but you got to read. I think the thing with school sometimes is that when a book is assigned and when you have to jump through a series of hoops and write essays and participate in class discussions,
Mhm.
books become work. And to me, the whole point, as you say, is that books need to be recognized from an early age as fun.
Mhm.
When it's fun and you read, you will develop at your own pace, based on your own interests and your own proclivities, into a reader who reads for fun. And that's, to me, the greatest joy in life is reading. I say that because my wife isn't around over here. She's actually number one. Books are number two on the off chance that she's sneaking. Sometimes she
Just
like
in
yeah,
case. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, of
Uh,
course.
I
Um,
can't. There's nothing I like more, and there's nothing that I think my parents did such a service to me by surrounding me with books from an early age and modeling for me how fun reading is. They always were reading.
100%. And I think, like you said there, about sort of removing the sort of the chore aspect, the work
Yeah,
aspect of it, where so much is to do with assessment and attainment and grading, as opposed to simply immersing yourself in character and narrative. That
yeah.
trying to encourage that swing that way, where you're not just doing it simply because it's homework or because you
It's
know you have an
really,
exam to cram for.
yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I was a huge reader from the jump, and when I was in school, as soon as a book was assigned, it was like a mano thing. It's like, I'm not going to read this book. Um,
Instant.
instantly, and consequently, I was just the worst. I was the worst. Cheat isn't the right word. I don't know really what it is. How do you manage to contrive an essay when you've only read the first chapter? That was my special skill.
Well, sure, yeah.
Like,
So we we would refer that, just to quote my drama teacher, he'd refer that to that as waffle. So like I once wrote an essay and I had a similar situation where our set text was incredibly boring, had no interest in reading it, sort of did a healthy skim. I think Spark Notes might have helped me with some of the translation. It was a Shakespearean text, which I should have been much more open-minded to and certainly am now. And I wrote, this was at a time, of course, before any computer typing or anything like that, so it was handwritten. And he returned my essay to me with the red pen and just wrote waffle across it because he could tell immediately the sort of the bullshit detector was
oh
going
yeah,
off at
oh yeah,
maximum. And he
yeah.
knew that I clearly had done it and sort of phoned it in. And actually,
I,
it
I,
was such a great
I don't
lesson.
know. I don't know why this was a special skill of mine, but I
Right.
was never caught.
Okay.
People thought I'd read the book. I mean, I don't know how I did it, but somehow my essays were always like very penetrating insights into Faulkner's blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
It's like, oh,
Well,
yeah, yeah,
how
yeah.
fascinating
You,
then that you found a career in performance and
I,
acting.
I know, sheer bullshittery. I don't know. I don't know. But I will say, years later, all the books that were assigned that I didn't read, I eventually read and loved.
Interesting.
It's just that at the time they were assigned, because they were assignments and because
Hmm.
it was a series of graduated steps that you were supposed to climb in a particular order, in a particular way, I balked.
Yeah.
I think some people go into the arts and maybe some people go into acting because they have an oddly rebellious nature. I was a
Mhm.
nice rebel. I mean, I was a decorous rebel in my own weird way. I would always raise my hand and object. Um, but I was fundamentally not inclined to follow anybody's prescriptions.
That's
Uh,
interesting that you say that because also that, certainly from my perspective when I was growing up studying acting, it was about figuring out who I was by being anyone but myself. It was
mhm.
having, putting on a mask and trying to almost like formulating a personality because the one I felt I had wasn't enough. And it
Oh,
was
it's
ironic.
interesting because to me it always seems like, the interesting thing about acting is that you are finding the other guy in you. I mean, it's
Yes.
ultimately how you find your Lear or Hamlet
Hmm.
based on your extrapolation of what you would do in those imaginary circumstances, based on a deeper plumbing of what it would feel like to you, were you to have lost a parent or to
Hmm.
have lost a parent that you loved but who you think was betrayed. I mean, you always use yourself to get to the other
Absolutely.
person, which is, I think, as I was an acting teacher for a number of years, what was
Ah,
always
okay.
challenging, interesting, was to sort of say to somebody, look, what you're ultimately doing, you'll probably never be an actor. It's an extremely not only difficult thing to do, but it's a parlous goddamn way to make a living.
Hmm.
But what it will show you is that there are depths in you that you simply have not, you have not plumbed.
Hmm. And it's a waste of potential too,
Yeah. Yeah. And whether or not you become an actor, you just say, I'm no longer going to be a carpet salesman. I'm going to become something else because
right?
I see that I have more potentiality. Acting is, I've never wanted to ever say, acting is the poor man's therapy, but nonetheless, it is a fun way to, and a challenging way to excavate self.
Yeah, that has a weird sort of tangential benefit to it that isn't perhaps what people would expect, especially when you're sort of using like, well, we're learning right now. My students
Yeah.
are studying Stanislavski, so emotional memory and accessing, the memory of feelings to portray the emotion. And they
Hmm.
sometimes again find that really tricky to wrap their head around. Well, I haven't been held at gunpoint. I haven't had to deal with loss, and it's like, well, no, it's
Well,
not the
yeah.
situation, it's the feeling that
And
you're
it's
accessing,
interesting because Stanislavski eventually kind of became two schools. It became the Strasbergian school, and he really did emphasize sense
right?
memory and emotional memory. And then it became the Meisner school, which
Hmm.
very much was about, look, it's the imaginative exercise, and then it's about freeing yourself to be open to the experience in the moment based on what your acting partner is giving you. And I confess, I tend to be more on the latter side because you're right.
Interesting.
You don't know necessarily, you don't have a direct emotional experience, particularly when you're younger, of what it might have been like to have been physically assaulted or to have been
Or
brutalized.
precisely, you just don't have enough life, do you, behind
But
you?
you can
That's
imagine your way
yeah.
into, and it is the imaginative muscle that is actually boundless. And that's
Mm.
the muscle to me that actors want to train. Um, there's a word that I always used to use when I taught, which is risability. The idea that you can rise to the occasion of your imagination, that you actually have the ability to excite or incite emotion based on the way you fantasize. We all fantasize all the time. We're engaged in these conversations with ourselves. Or if that guy said to me, you know what I would do? I would. And then we go down these amazing rabbit holes. That to me is more effective a
Hmm.
way to think about the work than the Strasbergian exercises, which I always found sort of tedious. Of now imagine, now remember what it was like, and what was the room, and what was the
Yeah.
apple, what did it taste like. Meisner famously said, actors can be egomaniacal enough. It's like the challenge with an actor is to get you out of yourself and into your partner's behavior.
Hmm.
So don't get an actor to actually be in their head thinking about something that happened in the past to conjure an emotion, because it's actually not conducive to better
Well,
work.
no, and also that becomes so tricky again, especially for younger people, I find, to try and teach that concept because the idea of truly being able to empathize with something that you haven't experienced yourself is such a challenging concept for them at their point to wrap their brains around and have that
Yeah,
ability to access, which is
yeah,
something, again, I think is such a, for me, certainly on the other side of it now, my sort of my ripe old mid-30s age, that I get to explore that, but from a sort of a quote unquote wiser perspective, because I've had some life. I've had my family, I've suffered loss, I've suffered great success as well as failure, and that gives me more tools in my toolkit. And that's what I try to explain to them too, is it is all about tools,
yeah.
leveraging the things that you know you have, and it's a building block. It's a
Yeah, and
process to
and
then
and
get
it
that
is
over time.
undoubtedly true that unless you are a wunderkind, you're going to come into your best actor later in life after you've had more life
Hmm.
experience, and as you say, after you've developed a certain odd tool of empathy
Yeah.
that you're not even cognizant that you don't necessarily have in your tool chest. I remember when I graduated from college, my one of my teachers, a guy named Philip Miner, uh, said to me at a party, boozy party, he said, yeah, you want to be an actor. 20 years from now, you'll succeed. It was like, 20 years? I'm 20. What,
I've
40? What am
got.
I supposed to do for the next 20 years?
What am I doing now? Like, come on.
Yeah, now at 65, I think, 40, even at 40, I sucked. Took me till, and even now, I suspect, 85-year-old me would turn around and say, at 65, you're okay.
It worked
You're,
out, right?
you're all
But then
right.
that's something actually I've said this. We've had conversations amongst our staff body in the school. Is that if you certainly from a teaching side, I would certainly relate this to drama and performance, but just teaching generally. If you think you've figured it out, then it's probably time to retire. It's time to move on. I think if you think you've unlocked the answer to what it
Yeah,
makes to be an effective practitioner, I think
yeah.
it's well then perhaps it's time to find something else to do.
Well, and I think generally speaking in life, passing the baton and moving on to other things is one of the great gifts of being alive.
For sure, no, 100%. And actually, you said something earlier that was really interesting about,
Was it about
the
bathing? Do I need to bring that book out
please,
again?
if we could have a visual
This
prop.
this is the way we take a bath. The
This is
emphasis.
what the
This
people
is the
want.
way to take a bath, lunkhead.
Why aren't you listening from across the pond?
Yeah, come on.
You Brits with your Brexits, not knowing how to bath.
That's right. Brexit. That was the moment I thought the world is going to be in trouble. Right
Yep.
before Trump's election, Brexit passed. I thought,
Oh,
oh,
dude, we're in the soup of that right now. We're in the soup, and obviously, not to get too
well, I
political.
don't know if you saw the news today that basically Trump just like literally turned on Zelensky in the middle of a news conference
That's
on
right.
camera,
With this,
berated
with
him.
when they gathered, the staff gathered, and it was
Yeah, and
yeah,
kicked him out of the White House. It's
yeah,
like, what? Why are we going through? Why is
yeah.
this?
If it
It
if it
almost makes.
wasn't so immensely troubling, that
Oh,
political landscape, if it wasn't so sort of like gut-wrenchingly frustrating, it would be sort of almost a parody. Sometimes I feel like I'm watching SNL sketches when I
uh,
see some of those clips, and it looks like it's written. It looks like it's something that is
yeah.
is a sort of a scripted farce, like something you'd see on
And I
Monty
don't.
Python.
I mean, the thing is, it's so frustrating to me. Is it's like, okay, he's a sociopathic, narcissistic personality disorder lunatic motherfucker.
Yes.
But every Republican member of the Congress is a Quisling. And
Mm,
in the end, I have less respect for respect. I have zero respect.
mm.
But I get more furious with the Quislings than I do with Donald Trump because
Yep.
I think Trump is out of his mind.
Yes. It's the chicken shititis that I
Oh
struggle
my
with.
God, have
I
mercy. I
Yeah.
spend a lot of time calling up some of these sons of bitches and just like, John Oliver, who I don't think you're allowed to watch because he says nasty things about you. But we still love him.
Oh,
Um,
dude, no, no, he's up
I
there.
know, I know, I know.
Colbert and Oliver are, and Stewart. They're kind of over here, massive,
Yeah.
certainly.
So I love Johnny Oliver, and he's like, sometimes you just have to call and just call them fucking assholes. That's
Yeah,
what.
yeah,
Don't
yeah.
just that.
It's
I
funny, isn't it?
get
Because there's so much of that. discourse against, especially against the left, is often about this idea of it's all too emotional. But the thing is, nuanced conversation can only happen if the other side is willing to participate.
Yeah.
It's not feasible to have a reasonable discourse and a back and forth if someone
Yeah.
can't acknowledge reality,
No,
right?
all you can do is make them gulp at the thought that the price tag is going to be higher than they thought it would be. And I
Yeah.
mean, we just recently we had I segued into something that's not pure drivel, but that actually has
Oh,
tremendous
genuine
repercussions for
meaning.
the world. But
Well,
we had
I give myself that caveat in the branding because it's some drivel.
oh, some drivel. All right, some drivel
Yeah,
with an asterisk. Okay,
yeah,
well
yeah.
this part is not drivel,
It's
but this is
yeah.
also the part that one bangs one's head against the wall because I have
Oof.
no
Yeah.
idea what to do anymore.
Well, okay, let's, John, I want to ask you about that then, because I think it is, there's scope here to cover it, because I find, certainly as someone who doesn't have any sort of famous recognition, I find it immensely frustrating, just as a reader, as someone who would be scrolling across social media or looking at the news, to when people sort of the classic sort of keyboard warrior comments where they'll say things like, actors should only act. I don't watch your films to be quote unquote lectured politically. And I find it odd, I think, that this sort of this divorcing of this idea between like of an actor not being therefore human just because they entertain and they are a commodity, quote unquote, or they provide that service, that they aren't allowed to be politicized and have an
Well,
opinion.
particularly insofar as so many people in the nominal news business are themselves infotainers. I mean, tell
Right.
me what the difference is between Donald Trump, for God's sake, who
Yeah.
made his bones as a reality TV show host, or Sean Hannity, whose show is pure enter drivel,
Sure.
entertainment,
Yeah. In
driveltainment.
unfortunately a much more concerning sense, isn't it?
Yeah, I
But
mean, they want to claim, many of these people who say that, they want to claim that they somehow are journalists when they are no more than entertainers themselves. But to your broader point, no. In the end, it's can you back it up? I mean, bring the
yeah,
receipts. If you can make a cogent argument and you can hold forth in a way that actually gets
right.
people to not only tune in, but that makes sense. I think we all have experienced what it's like to kind of hear people who are personalities, and let's not just say entertainers, but anybody who you kind of turn an ear to because you've heard about them,
Hmm.
sports figures, actors, ex-politicians, what have you,
For sure.
and you feel like they don't know what the fuck they're talking about, or they make claims that are not
Uh-huh.
verifiable, or they go off on an emotional diatribe that doesn't ever connect to a broader point about what they
So
feel that.
that right there, that's I think that addresses the key point here because it's this idea that simply because you have a platform that sort of automatically makes you right. The notion of someone's
Yeah.
opinion being worth the same as someone else's fact, which I
Yeah.
really struggle with that. Certainly from afar, I find that very difficult. And
Yeah.
I've definitely written more comments, like I've written and deleted more comments than I've posted, you
I
know.
mean, I have now, in all candor, I've just completely divorced myself from social media.
Hmm.
As is always the case, there's good and bad. I
Hmm.
mean, there are doubtless people who are able to use a cell phone to penetrate the world's great libraries. Unfortunately, for every one guy is doing that, nine people are looking at porn. And I think the reality is, as much as there is good to be found in social media, and some of the people who are commenting cogently and intelligently, and there's certainly, the
Sure.
ability to access a lot more information. I think I won't say on balance, but the pernicious aspect, these algorithms that exist that basically just keep people, cycling through the same bullshit,
Yeah.
hearing the same voices, has proven to be, tremendously damaging to
Hmm.
our discourse and our capacity to speak to each other. And I just, at this point, have sort of decided I don't want to participate.
No, and that's first of all completely a legitimate position to hold, but also it's this idea that engagement is best served when it is inflammatory and when it's encouraging people to essentially share their own anger.
But
And I
the
just
the
find that this,
algorithms exist to inflame. I mean,
yeah,
that's my problem is that the nature of the beast, it's constructed so as to give rise to those feelings. And we as people who then are baited and tricked and
mhm,
seduced into losing our tempers, we turn to ourselves and say, "What's wrong with me?" Well, if you're fed a diet of poison and you're poisoned, is it your fault?
sure. That's the thing, isn't it? You're forcing yourself to look inward when actually it's that external nonsense that
Yeah, and
creates that response.
that's really, I mean, that's one of the things that is so pernicious about what's happening right now is that to a certain extent, I mean, we turn against each other here in America. We turn on people who have different political opinions. I find I might do it all the time. It's the leopard ate my face too joke, you know. Oh
Hmm.
my God, I was a Republican. I didn't think I was going to lose my job, but now it's happened to me. And
Mm.
you feel this like you know, sense of ha ha, uh,
Sure.
Schadenfreude. But the reality is that those people, there was a woman who just recently, lost her job, and she posted about it. And she talked about, I wasn't political, but then she talked about some of the people who are in her orbit, who are actually spewing a lot of, you know, mendacities that they've picked up from right-wing media. If you are getting buried in lies and you
Yeah.
become a liar,
Yeah.
we blame the individual who votes for Donald Trump, and it's like 73 million people. It's like, oh,
Right.
but it's people who have been swallowing so much
For
vomit.
sure. They become almost products of the things they're exposed to. And that certainly from, I mean, I think it's a very lofty position to hold for me to sort of say looking from afar. But, being leaders of the Western world, it does affect us. There is a certain, we're not immune to the impact of that sort of wider policy and where that
No,
shift has swung, towards populism and
well, I
those
mean,
aspects. And
climate change alone, you know, I
yeah,
mean, it's just, I mean, if there's any, you know, where do you begin to despair? But the idea that we have a, you know, a climate change denier back in the Oval Office at this stage in world history is so profoundly depressing.
and sort of fascinating in a terribly frightening way. I mean, the big one I know certainly from myself and my wife, we follow particularly Colbert. We really like his monologue. We watch a
Yeah.
lot of his stuff. I think it's beautifully written, and sometimes it deliberately indulges in the immature. And I think that's a nice antidote.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it's a
Yeah.
really nice sort of balm
Yeah.
almost to some of the stuff that we're
Well,
having to talk
from
about.
across the pond, I would like nothing more than to see Starmer and the entire European leadership class refuse to bend a knee to the guy. I
For
mean, you
sure.
know,
Yeah, unfortunately, that we haven't drawn quite the harsher line in the sand that I would have liked from
no, I'd like to see that happen.
our
In the
politics.
Department of Small Good News, it's very interesting to me to see that the Canadian Conservative Party, which was up in the polls by like, you know, ridiculous amounts,
Yes.
now
Yeah, yeah.
tied with the Liberals
Yeah.
after all these years of Trudeau. And it's like anybody but Trudeau. Now Trudeau's stepping down, but still, I think a lot of countries are realizing, wait a minute, this might be what we get too.
Hmm.
It's a little too late for Germany, but you know,
Sure.
um,
But then that's the thing, isn't it? That it sort of becomes like it becomes an infection that can't be stopped when they realize that it's pervasive, isn't it? They see the numbers, they see the fact that Trump won the popular vote for the first time in any of his runs, and they'll look at that and think, does that validate that approach then? Therefore, it's what's resonating. It's such a
it is, and we can get off politics, but obviously I'm pretty political. I mean, years ago, Ronald Reagan famously said, "Oh, here's a joke. Oh, what's the worst thing you'll ever hear? Ding dong, hello, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." Ha 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 ha. That was the epitome of what was wrong.
yeah.
And it's been Republican policy for years and years and years and years and years to run down governance and to run down competency and to run down intelligence and to run down skills
And
and
oversight. That's the one.
oversight.
Yeah.
Everything that would actually stand in the path of oligarchy getting to do whatever the fuck they want. And it's succeeded. It's not
Yeah.
just that Trump won the popular vote, it's that 20 million people who voted in the last election during COVID at a time when it seemed existential, uh, turned away and didn't vote at all this time.
Hmm.
There's a huge number of American citizens that never vote, in large part because I think they say a pox on all their houses. There simply is no, you
Of
know,
course. Yeah,
capacity.
and actually those that do, I've often found, certainly in our country, we found that certainly in my constituency, my sort of local town Jewish voting trends, they tended to sort of be that you sort of get to a certain age and a certain demographic, and you sort of, if you've always voted a certain way, that's the way you're probably going to vote, regardless of the candidate. You sort of become party loyalty rather than sort of, the notion of what this person represents or what their policies are. If you've always say been conservative in our country, you're voting conservative. If you've always been liberal, you're doing the same. And it's not a hard and fast rule, but for many of our repeated conservative, we've been
Yeah.
austerity for the last nearly 2 decades before
Yes,
this
you
current
have.
Labour government. that seemed to be the trend, certainly in my town, which never really made sense. We're a working class town that always seemed to vote conservative, and it was always really bizarre that there are the kind of people that would live in our area, the amount of students and kids on free school meals and the sort of lower income families. It just never really connected in my head how they could lean so far to the right. But equally, it seemed to be more that sort of, again, that populist idea that's become so pervasive. I never could have predicted that this was
Well,
something that would
it's
endure.
I think it's the unfortunate reality of climate change refugeeism and the idea that unfortunately us against the other is always the most powerful message in politics.
Hmm.
They are coming. They are pouring over our borders.
Hmm.
It's only going to get worse. We have to become ever more diligent to make sure they do not take us over. And it leads inexorably towards, if not fascism, at least fascism light, you
Hmm.
know.
Well,
I
we we experienced a bit of that. It was one of my. I was talking to a friend of mine who's part of a Burly Bird Media. We do podcasts together, and we sort of were off air. We were talking about how when Boris Johnson was our prime minister, it felt like sort of the Coke Zero of Trump. It was sort of
exactly.
like it's sort of like
Yes,
the Miller Lite of something
indeed.
like that.
Indeed it did. Indeed it did. Half the poison. Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. Well,
Yeah.
look, I mean that this is something I think that's so important, particularly in the kind of work that you do, because look at the nature of your career. Everything that you've done has always, you mentioned yourself, you're a character actor, right? But the idea that just because of your chosen profession, you shouldn't be allowed to share your views on things on an open platform of people choosing to follow you. You are
Yeah.
not, you're not speaking to them, you're just speaking when you tweet or
Yes,
whatever.
that's very true, and I would like to think that I would not be inclined to speak about politics if I didn't read a lot. I'd like to
Sure.
think at least I appreciate the fact that if I'm going to talk about something, I should know enough about it to not represent myself poorly.
Well,
And rep
you're attacking it from an informed place, and that's something where it gives it immediate, well, not just legitimacy, but worth as well. It's worth the discourse and the conversation.
Yeah, and that is always a tricky thing, you know. I mean, again, not just whether or not you're a public personality or not, but there's only so much time that one has available. So one can speak in broadly philosophical terms. It is trickier for somebody who is not deeply well versed, for instance, in
Hmm.
public health, to talk about vaccination rates and et cetera and et cetera and et cetera, climate change. I'm not Elizabeth Colbert. I can't hold forth on, climatology. So I think one of the things that can happen is that anybody can get a bit out ahead of their skis in terms of what they seemingly profess to have knowledge about.
Right.
What they really have are opinions. And it's an easy place to attack people. It's like, you
Yes.
don't know what you're talking about.
It's almost like a sort of template comment, isn't it, that can be written in response to that? Is it a very
Yeah.
sort of cookie cutter kind of reply? Well, that's something again that's really interesting to me because certainly switching gears to kind of the acting perspective now, I look at some of the work you've done, particularly in science fiction. Obviously, I mean, I still I don't know why this stuck out to me so much when I was preparing for our chat. But your guest starring role in Stargate was something that really, really like stuck out to me. That one episode, that fascinating character that you played in there, who was so awkward and sort of so the complete antithesis to the very archetypal heroes of SG-1. And what a pleasure that must have been to explore something like that. But then you sort of contrast that with getting a regular gig on something like Star Trek, where obviously you played Phlox for those 4 seasons. I looked at that character who seemed always to be very moral, very principled, which again
Mhm.
clearly is informed by your own education, your own reading, your prior career, and also obviously the how contemporary you are in your opinions and your discourse. But he was a very moral character who was very
Yes,
principled.
which had nothing to do with me, you understand. I mean, obviously, I only read the words that are written. So
Well,
to the
that
extent,
and thank you for that because that
yeah,
was my question: is how much of that came from you, or was that the text?
it's always the text. I mean,
Right.
what you hope if you're a series regular is that the nature of your temperament and your personality um, resonates, so that writers begin to bend a little bit towards you, your sense of humor, the way you
Hmm.
deliver something. But it's ineffable. It's very hard to put your finger on it, and I don't know that I would ever feel comfortable saying that anyone in the writing room got me and began to
Right.
write my voice. I don't think that would be fair or true. I think it's more me getting what they were trying to say and being able to deliver it.
Nice. Okay, so that's interesting because then this idea of him, being, I think, it certainly now as you've identified, being written to be a very principled, very moral character, are there certain principles of acting and your approach to character that, much like Phlox as a role who had his sort of very clear compass and moral center, are there things that, regardless of whether it was a one-off, a one-shot, or something you get to explore for hopefully multiple seasons, depending on the show and the character, are there certain things you always look to find in those characters, either a point of empathy where you can connect with them, or something that maybe like as a character actor, something to give you a bit of differentiation? Is there sort of one thing, is it like a physical thing, a vocal thing that you always try to look for first when you're building a character and attacking a role?
I think you always want to find the humor in it. I mean, I think you always want to have an
Nice.
understanding of what the characters, what the everybody has a sense of humor. Everybody has their own sense of playfulness. So I think to a certain extent you're trying to find one just technically moments of humor because
Mm,
those I think can pull an audience in if they feel like there's going to be humor. I don't do sitcoms generally speaking because I don't care much for that. I can enjoy watching some sitcoms,
sure.
but I don't particularly like the three jokes a page,
Mm,
obligation. I'm more interested in how a human personality has developed. It's his or her own unique style and sense of playfulness and humor and how that comes out and can be found in a text. The
mm,
physical and vocal reality of who you are, particularly in film and television, they do not, generally speaking, when they cast you, as opposed to when you're perhaps doing a stage show, they're not looking for an impersonation unless it is specifically come in and give us your Howard Cosell, or we're
sure.
looking to Howard Cosell. Generally speaking, they want you to be you. So
Mm.
I'm not necessarily trying to find a Phlox was a bit of an exception because they specifically said come in with a slight alien accent. But
Oh, right.
generally
Okay.
speaking, I accept the fact that whatever choice I make is going to manifest itself with my voice and through the odd quirks and ticks of my body and my
Right.
gesture
Because
vocabulary.
that, I think that eccentricity really came through particularly with Phlox. And I don't know whether that again was something that you had sort of brought through your own temperament and your own approach, or that it was inherent in the character. Is it something, was it obvious that he
You
was
may
always going to be like that?
you may lean into a few more ticks because you feel like because it is an alien species, you're looking for some things that would read as eccentric, either in the
Hmm.
physical behavior or in the vocal behavior. But that's a very rare exception. I mean, generally speaking, most of the time you're playing humans. And
Right.
in those instances, unless you are asked to have a specific accent, which doesn't happen a ton in film and television, because they can get somebody with that accent. They want an Australian, they can get an Australian. Generally speaking, I'm not even thinking about that. I'm only thinking about where is this person's where does this person find humor in
Right. Okay. Interesting.
what is being given? What
Would
is
that
this
would that
person's
would that still apply though? Do you still look for that in some of those? I mean, I've seen like
the
your,
killers? Absolutely.
yeah, like X-Files,
Yeah,
CSI,
yeah.
like,
Well, because the one thing that villains always have is they have a sense of joy. I
right.
mean, I loathe Donald Trump down to the, down to the molecules inside of me. One of the odd, perverse things that I think people like about him is he's joyful in a dark, perverse way.
Yeah.
He takes what
Reveling in his maniacal
Yeah,
nature.
I mean, there's something that happened in the campaign trail, and I will only use this to analogize. I don't won't get sucked back into the politics. There was a one of his little dog and pony shows where he decided he was just going to dance on stage
Right.
about
Yes.
40, and all the fucking analysts said, well, this shows he's off,
Mm,
you know, he can't stick a message. And I remember thinking at the time, it's like, fuck. That's
mm.
going to have tremendous resonance with a lot of people because he's doing something that is so off the script and so is about him, enjoying himself that
Hmm.
it's going to actually redound to his benefit.
Yep. And it's
Um,
not it's not enough that the people that were always convinced of his idiocy, where they would look at that and go, "See, we were right," but that didn't really change the discourse around that because people that already knew his who he truly is, that
no,
wasn't new information.
And
for
the
them.
people who like the party that is Donald Trump,
Mm,
the dark party though it is, it's like he's partying. So
right.
villains take joy in their villainy, and that is always, to me, a key aspect of any time you're playing the bad guy is like, where's the sense of humor? Where's the sense of delight? You know,
Yeah,
Where-
find that hook.
yeah. The text itself always has, to me, the obligation of a text is that you're always trying to find where the surprises are. Where does the
Hmm.
change get wrong? You come in wanting what you want. Your character is fighting for something, an intention. What's the objective?
Hmm.
We language that differently as actors. But then something happens. Something comes up. Any scene worth its salt, there's a surprise, there's a twist. He gets balked. He finds out new information. Turns out that what he thought he wanted isn't what he wants after all. The key is being really clear about where the changes are and how the changes result in a change of behavior that is like interesting.
Hmm.
I think if there's anything that to me usually kind of is indicative of where an actor is not seasoned or experienced, it's that a choice is made, and the whole text is about the monochrome presentation of that action or intention from the same attack.
Mm. It becomes sort of flat, doesn't it? Almost like
Yeah,
we sort of
it
see
totally
like
becomes
if the stage direction say was something like expressing a sense of frustration, that is the flavor that they're presenting. That is what we
exactly,
see.
exactly, exactly. And that's the one trap sometimes because we all, those of us who teach and those of us who've studied acting their whole lives, we are all taught to present to approach this from an active standpoint. What is my action? What am I
Mm.
pursuing? What do I want? Why do I want it? The tendency sometimes is to feel like, I want, and then you drive that fucker through the scene without regard
Yeah. You stop
to,
listening to the other actor. You're not really
yeah,
present. You're just sort of
e-
that's where it becomes, I think, very mechanical, very
exactly.
manufactured.
You have labeled it, you have
Mhm.
stamped it, you have solved it, and
I have decided I am jealous here, and that becomes the
exactly,
intention.
exactly.
Is
That
there,
becomes
have there been any sort of like whether it was I don't know whether and this is obviously a very subjective thing that'll be personal to you, but have you ever been faced with a script you've been presented either in audition material or the you book the role and you're on set where just you draw a line, you look at the content and it's something maybe you're uncomfortable performing, or you just don't think the words will resonate in a way that makes
um,
sense.
to the extent I was never briefly. I think I was at a point in my career some years back when I was offered a few things, but generally speaking, I've always had to audition. And if I find I'm really uncomfortable with the material because I think it's just either puerile or offensive, I don't like to do horror movies. I
Right.
don't misogynistic violence against women. I've done some things in the past on network television that would belie that, but generally speaking, I'm going to pass on those things. I don't do
Okay.
things that are, for political reasons or espousing things I don't believe. Um, I tend not to turn things down just on a like I don't think it's a well written basis because so many things aren't well written,
Right.
and
Okay.
your job as an actor to a certain extent is to do what you can to kind of imbue something that may be flat on the page with more dimensionality.
Hmm.
Um, Probably, if there's anything, it doesn't happen very often. Once in a blue moon, you find yourself bumping up against a director who's asking for a behavior that you don't think is called for. As if, for
Right.
instance, one of these, there was a director on, I can't remember the show, Hawaii Five O, who I played I was an attorney who had two kids. I represented their parents. The parents were murdered, and I was trying to help these kids figure out, oh my God, what happened? Let me protect you. Let me serve your legal interests. The director came up and said, we want to think that maybe he did it. So could you play this scene in a way that would make us think, I don't know about this guy? And it's like, no, no, I can't because the action of the scene is very clearly about attempting to comfort and counsel distraught children that he cares about.
Right.
You're asking for a surface behavior that you're imposing on me because you want to do something for the audience. But if it's not on the page and it's not in the action, then it's going to be stupid. And I'll show you.
How
And I
stupid it will
did.
be.
I'll
Yeah.
show you how stupid it's going to be. I couldn't quite say it as baldly as that, but I did it. And he came up afterwards and sort of begrudgingly said, "Yeah, do it the way you were doing it."
Right.
and,
Okay.
and he didn't like me after that and was kind of mean to me through the rest of the show, but it was like, don't take it out on me, you should have
No.
known better
I
you
think the
know
notion of someone then being too precious to be wrong, I think is somewhat
Yeah,
disappointing, especially in the
yeah,
role that they're in there.
yeah,
Um,
and that is an occasional problem.
mm.
A friend of mine, the late great John Aylward, a wonderful actor, he said, you ultimately have to be director proof as an actor. Fingers crossed, you get a great director, and you're simpatico, and you speak the same language, and you get what you want always from a director, which is insight and imagination and spark. It's like, oh yeah, let's try that. I like
Oh,
that.
there is something, and I know that sort of again it's very difficult to quantify, but there is something where I find it with students I direct in youth theatre that you suddenly have that it is a sort of connecting the dots moment
Yeah,
where you suddenly realize that you are singing from the same hymn sheet. They
yeah,
completely understand the nuance of your direction, and that
yeah.
you might not have had to been very explicit. They're able to sort of go on yeah, I can see what you want us to do with that, and I'm happy to take a risk and try it. And
Yeah,
that is
and
there's nothing
it's
more freeing or satisfying.
and more times than not, particularly in television, less so in film, but particularly in television, where you got to get 8 to 9 pages shot a day. You don't have time for a lot of elaborate conversation. You don't have time to kind of dissect the script. You don't have time to say, well, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. You're going for a result pretty quickly. Hopefully you get a director who's on the same page in terms of the result, who understands your process and doesn't get in the way of it, and you're not going to diverge from what he wants, because it's pretty clear what the script is calling for.
Right? Yeah, it's fairly
uh,
obvious there. That's
yeah.
actually something that, again, when you're looking at the Star Trek franchise, I've seen a number of actors. Jonathan Frakes from The Next Generation has spoken to this. I know some of the Voyager cast have mentioned it too. That often, certainly in that era of Star Trek, TNG to Enterprise, the '90s to early 2000s era, that there wasn't really any scope for improvisation
No.
or
Yeah.
tweaking. And is that reflective of your experience in Star Trek as well? Is that it,
Well, it's
it was
reflective of my experience on television generally, because you
Oh,
can't.
okay.
I mean,
Okay.
once in a blue moon. I mean, oddly, you mentioned it, but Stargate, they had a very playful sensibility, and they were
Right.
fine. The actors riff. There was a sort of a shaggy dog feel to the whole, thing.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, that then
But
does connect again with what Bob Picardo said once about going from Trek to Gate when he went to
yeah, oh
Atlantis. He
yeah,
did the season there.
radically different, radically different.
Yeah.
But 9 times out of 10, I mean, and more than that, television can't allow for improvisation because, one, somebody who's a shitty improver is going to slow things down.
Yep.
You know, the script is the script. It has to come in at 47 minutes, in an hour,
Hmm.
flat. Not 46, not 48, 47 minutes. You can't have the bagginess of improvisation. You
Right.
know, a page lasts a certain amount of time, and they know, the directors know, the producers know what the requirement is to get this story told. The scene lasts, that most of the time we all intuitively understand the obligations of the scene, and we're performing it the way it has to be performed. It doesn't mean that within the work I do there isn't color or variation or different
Sure.
choice perhaps, or different emphasis than another actor might bring, but I'm working within the channel of the text, and the
Yes.
director is
Yeah,
working
yeah.
with the channel of the text. You're not radically, taking it apart. People who aren't very good at improvising will improvise themselves out of that channel, and will improvise themselves out of the
Right.
obligation of the scene, and they will fuck it up.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? There's improv and keep is only a great concept if the things that you're improvising, there's more things to keep than edit out, right? And that's a
Yeah,
tricky
I mean,
balance to
what
navigate.
you will get, and you'll get this on film. Just did a small bit with Jack Black, and the director was great. The director was saying, "Do it this way, do it that way, try this, try that." What if he comes in like really hot, like, "Well, I can't believe you're fucking this up." And now what if he comes in as completely different? "I'm really upset that you're fucking this up, Jack."
Right, right, right.
And on film, if you have, you can take 3.5 hours for a 1.5 page scene. You can't do that on television. And you can do so many variations and cover it each way. So you have editing
Mm.
points that you actually can play.
Do you
But
do you like multiple takes?
I love it. I love it. But you can't expect it on TV. And I
Right.
have a great, for me, coming from TV more than film, and I've done, I don't know, maybe 35 or 40 films, but I've done a lot of TV. The thing on TV is that you have to own and understand what the obligation of the day is and what the obligation of a show is. You have to put yourself in the producer's chair. The producer needs to make their day. They cannot go into overtime. That crew is killed as it is.
Hmm.
It's long, arduous days. So, an actor says, "Can I have another take? I just think that maybe," it's like, no, no. If you think that you really missed a significant beat, or you feel like, they don't see that the way you did this is not going to match with the master or is going to undercut the other actor's performance in some way, if you can legitimize another take, great. But if you're feeling like, I don't know, I just feel like maybe I could do that better, move on.
Yeah, if it's in service of vanity, it's
And
not.
it and it
Yeah,
and it mostly is.
right.
I can honestly say that for the most part, when people are asking for another take, it's like you don't need one. It's better. It's better to, if you're going along in a scene, this takes a little seasoning, but eventually you learn it. If you're going along in a scene and you fuck up a moment, or you feel like, what, that section is not as strong as it's going to be, you can just stop. Camera's still rolling. I'm going back. And you go back 5 beats and you pick it up from where you feel like you're off track and you
And
go
then
forward.
continue from there.
Yeah. It saves you every time they say cut, no matter how much they say go, this happens all the time. Directors will say, okay, we're just going to do three in a row. And it's like, no, you won't. You're going to do one, and then there's going to be some tweak. The lighting guy is going to say, Charlie, I think move that. Oh, well, hey, while we're stopped, you never get three in a row. Maybe once in a
Right.
blue moon. But generally speaking, when somebody says cut, there's a good likelihood it's going to be another 5 minutes at least before you roll again.
Okay.
To me, it's like I feel like I have an obligation to get the day going. So I'm gonna figure out how to keep it going without having to do another take if I can.
Sure. And I suppose that also then if you know you're conscious of that, the implication for the producers, the crew, the budget, the time, making the day.
Yeah, and and candidly, it's how you develop a good reputation for being a good citizen.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there are actors who we know are going to be like, it's like trying to get a fucking loose tooth out to get them out of the trailer to come to the set. It's like,
Yeah, right. I've never understood that. I really struggle with that. Just the idea that you've managed to book a role, potentially, especially in a very prolific project with a decent budget, and that it becomes this sort of, well, the idea that anything like that in that world suddenly becomes like equivalent to manual labor. As much of a chore as it is for
it's
that
a
to coax
it's a
them out. I,
it's
I
a
just think
weird
is
cooking
fascinating.
match. I mean, usually it's names, or people who
Right.
kind of feel like, they that is their show. And but I found it. I did a show called The Nine years ago, and I really liked the crew. They were really nice, but there were a bunch of us in the cast and the regulars cast, and people would kind of like trickle in a little bit. So I said to the crew, I'm gonna see if I can help this a little bit.
Mm.
So I was usually the early first one usually on set. As people filtered in, I said, "Hey, how would you feel about like everybody whoever every time we're called to the set, whoever shows up last puts $5 in the bucket at the end of every week. I don't know if you know this. At the end
Nice.
of the week, there's usually a drawing, and people put in 20
What a
bucks. And
great instinct, John. That's so cool.
so, and it was usually one actor, and he got really pissed off because I said it intentionally, knowing that this actor was going to be the last one on the set.
Right.
So when he showed up, I was able to say, "So we all agreed that the last person who shows up for any take puts $5 in the bucket." Yeah, that sounds good to me. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we all agree.
Actor was like, "Oh, all right, now starting now," and I said, "Yeah,
That's
you got $5."
that's so funny too, because like I know we've talked off air about this, the idea of, you do have you do spend a lot of time, energy, and headspace in sort of philanthropic ideas, in charity, and sort of trying to play your part, however small, to try to be an agent of change. And obviously the thing you've referenced there is very much, set dynamics and work ethic. But I know that, my goodness, you've done a tremendous amount of work. I know that Trek Talks, I believe, is something that you've hosted and is coming up soon, isn't it, in April?
It is. It's coming up on April 5th, and I'll preface it by saying that Trek Talks is a benefit for an organization called the Hollywood Food Coalition, which is an organization that is very dear to my heart, which I have been involved with for about 8 years,
Right.
and I helped to lead it for a little while. I have stepped back from doing administrative and oversight work with it, but I still care for it very much. We're for many years an organization that fed a hot meal to all comers 7 nights a week. We still do that, as well as providing ancillary services and support services. But during the years I was there, my wife and I also helped to grow its capacity to feed and serve more people. We now rescue about 2.5 million pounds of food a year, which
It's
we
incredible.
share with other charitable organizations so as to buttress and augment their programming. So, for
As if
instance,
you're then sort of allowing them to facilitate from there.
yeah. So, like a battered
Nice.
women's shelter that may not have great food. The
Right.
gag being that, one of the things you want to provide to the people that you're serving is the opportunity of having 3 squares a day.
Right.
Drug and alcohol rehab program. You're probably going to keep people in
Right.
the program if you're feeding them well. A place for kids to come in off the streets. They may be coming back if they're getting good food on a regular basis. So that's really become the heart and soul of what we do, I think,
Nice.
which I love. And the furtherance of the idea, because we're the Hollywood Food Coalition, that the relationships we're forging with other not for profits allows us to help build a better social safety net writ large. That a lot of these community groups, social service organizations, I know you yourself are involved in mental health work,
Mhm.
a lot of these organizations, there's a tendency for us to all be very siloed, to not get to know each other, work with each other. I do my thing, you do your thing. I
Yeah,
go
very
after
autonomous.
you go after your grant money. To me, I think what we're trying to figure out is ways to say, one, even in our sector, food rescue and sharing food, there are a lot more partners that we need to work with to
Hmm.
get more done. But also in the social service sector writ large, there's a lot of relationship building that could happen that would help build better structures and systems. And we can't do it if we don't say that that's one of our reasons for being.
Sure, I mean that the notion of collaboration is such a powerful one, particularly with a charitable enterprise, because
Yeah.
it gives you the perspective to know that you cannot be the be all and end all. It's
Yeah.
not, it cannot be all on you. As much as you might have the big heart and the intentions are clear, it's about forging, it is about relationships. And it's such
And
a weird crossover in your day job as well, because of,
yeah,
so much
and
of the industry is about that.
yeah, it's true, and I confess a lot of this for me, and I'll get to Trek Talks in a bit, which is the
Yeah.
one of the fundraisers we do to help raise money and awareness with Star Trek folks. But one of the things that always struck me, I had a theater company many, many years ago devoted to adapting fiction for the stage, and it was built along collectivist lines. It was like, hey, I want to get a lot of people together and say one of the things we aren't allowed to do as actors is to actually figure out what we want to say through our work. We're doing somebody else's text. There's
Right.
a world of great literature out there. What if you were empowered to go out and find something you wanted to work on, piece of prose, but performed verbatim in essence on stage? So shorter in length. We mostly did short fiction. But what if you actually felt like one of your jobs as an artist was to find texts that spoke to you? But to get that done required creating a system and a structure that gave people a lot of power,
Hmm.
but still didn't give them the power to, kick anybody else in the nuts. And I had to figure that out. And it was always interesting to me, even though I left that company. It survived, but I left. As I moved on, I was always interested in ways in which structures have to be both deeply democratic, and nonetheless, there still has to be lines of authority.
Hmm. A
And how
clear
you build them.
structure to it,
Yeah.
right? Despite,
How you,
and this is the thing we find sometimes that scope becomes the issue too, especially when you're involving other agencies and other people with different focus areas, is that your ideas become limitless, but your ability to actually deliver upon them becomes extremely, really, extremely challenging
yeah.
unless you're surrounding yourself with the right people with the right methodology. And
Yeah.
that's something that,
Yeah.
if as long as you root it in relationships and open conversation, then then that scope that apparently could very easily balloon can be something achievable, and you can do something with with those good intentions.
Yeah, it's hard.
Um,
It is extremely, extremely daunting. I feel very blessed that the
mhm.
woman we found to actually take over and run our organization, I think, is very much driven by these goals and got a marvelous, sunny, warm, can-do personality and is a perfect person to kind of build coalitions. But it is incredibly daunting work. But one of my heroes is Frances Perkins, who was the woman who became FDR's labor secretary. And when he started the New Deal in 32, we're in the Great Depression, the whole world is in rubble. This woman had devoted her life to trying to figure out how to build social service delivery systems in New York. And he turned to her and said, what you did, could we do that? She became his labor secretary and really was one of the great unsung heroes, I think, of the 20th century. She basically was the person who said, "Yeah, you could do it. Here's what I did. Da 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 da," and it was the New Deal.
It's fabulous. And what a great historical reference point there too, especially to inform your own passion and your own work. How
And
did
and
you find?
and in America, I mean, sadly, I mean, one of the great drivers of, for instance, hunger, the food stamp program, the SNAP program.
Right.
1 in 5 kids in America depends on food stamps. This administration is going to try
That's
to
a
gut.
that's a sobering statistic.
Well, and 1 in 5 American children is food insecure. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going hungry, but it means when they wake up in the morning, they're not entirely sure what they're going to eat, when they're going to eat, if it's going to be good, how much they're going to get, yada yada
Right.
yada. It is, I mean, poverty in America is very real, very constant for many people, and I would argue it is it is not only permitted, but to a great extent, it is conceived as a necessity for the
Mhm.
oligarchy to thrive,
Right.
which
And
is,
that's where the enormity of the problem can sometimes overwhelm and sort of
yeah.
make you go, well, what can I often I think a lot of people's barrier to entry with this kind of work is, well,
And
what can
so
I do then?
for me, the what can you do answer, which was what motivated me and what drove me,
Hmm.
is probably on a national level, you can't do a whole lot. But what you can do is look at the way structure works on a local level.
Yeah.
You can figure out a particular sector that might appeal to you. For me, it was social service delivery, but it could be ecology. It could be criminal justice. It could be local governance. It could be the arts. And you could say, where in the structure that exists could I fit in so as to improve the structure or address inefficiencies or deficiencies in the structure? That's where you can fit in. That's how you can belong. It could be the school system. It could be local political party. There's so many things that people can do locally that could make a difference. And
Hmm.
if that feels too abstruse or gigantic, it could be as simple as I'm going to commit to going and cleaning up the park every week. It doesn't have to all be like
Totally.
macro, but it
We
is
said,
local.
absolutely. We said the origin story of our an organization that my wife and I now run was if we can help one person and make their day just that little bit brighter. It might sound like a cliche, but I think the reason why it may sound cliche is because there's elements of truth in it. Is that if we can make one individual's day just seem that little bit more possible and have more possibility and seem brighter, then we've succeeded. Then we win. And then
Yeah,
anything else that follows is icing, you know?
yeah. And it's the wonderful lesson of that great movie, It's a Wonderful Life, the one
Hmm.
you don't know the good you've done. You can't see the result of the bank shots,
Hmm.
you know. But a bank shot, a ripple in the water, has tremendous potential effect. And you have to get off your ass. I mean, there's just no way around it. The other thing, to me about the keyboard warrior syndrome is that somebody wrote a book about this called Bowling Alone years ago. And the premise of this book was that when, there was a time when people were born into a society in which physical presence was expected. You had to go to the PTA meeting. You had to show up in church. You were going to be, on the bowling team, the bridge club, la 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 la. Physical presence in a society. I think it's a necessary correction to steps we've taken over the course of the last 25 years to absent ourselves from physical presence in society. That is needed.
Right. And that that too is that so interesting you mentioned that my organization Unique Minds that my wife and I run now was born during COVID, where physical presence became an impossibility for so many families in isolation. And that's
Yeah,
where we decided to try and be that 2% agent of change,
yeah,
recognizing a problem that became very profound very quickly.
yeah,
And trying to be on a very small scale, we weren't a national thing, we weren't a franchise or anything like that, but to try and affect meaningful change on a appropriate scale. And
yeah,
that's something that is, well, certainly, you don't do it for validation, but it certainly feels rewarding when you know it's something you can connect with where you live and where you
yeah,
are.
yeah.
And that
Absolutely.
is profound. There is something profound there, I think. I really do.
There is, and
Um,
I think, to me, I'll go to Trek talks, and then I'll double back around to something
yeah,
that's Trektivism, which is relevant to what we're talking about now.
for
But Trek
sure.
talks, this will be its fourth year. It's an 8-hour digital telethon, Jerry Lewis style. I'm Jerry Lewis, designed to raise money through Food
Nice.
Coalition. It's basically 8 hours of Star Trek content. So this year there'll be a big Discovery panel with a lot of the folks from
Oh,
Discovery. There'll
cool.
be a Lower Decks panel with Tawny Newsome and some of the other folks from
Oh,
Lower Decks.
fabulous.
We have things that are somewhat tangential. We focus on a particular episode from a particular season of a particular show. We have designers and composers and editors and directors and producers, but it's all Star Trek content interspersed with very short little videos about the Hollywood Food Coalition to tell our story.
Oh,
Rod
great.
Roddenberry kicks us off by making a sizable contribution, which we then try to match. So we've
Got it.
made somewhere around 100 to 110,000 a year for the last few years. April 5, YouTube, Trek Talks, TrekTalks. I like to say it's like going to a convention without having to wear pants. I
Yeah.
myself, I do not wear pants.
Oh, please. I mean, I am just this. There's a reason that this camera is framed this way,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
We know. Well, listen, John, I'll make sure that across our socials and across our community, we will point them to that. What was the date again in April? 5th of April,
April
did you say?
5, April
April
5,
5th.
10 a.m. Pacific Coast time here in America to 6 o'clock Pacific Coast time here in America. So
It's fantastic. We'll be pointing people to it. What a fantastic initiative. And I
yeah,
cannot think of a better way to wrap up our latest episode of Some Drivel. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in
absolutely.
to Some Drivel. This is our interview podcast, which you can find on This is the way we take a bath. That you can find us on all of the social platforms at Burly Bird Media, and this podcast will be up on both YouTube, Podbean, and Spotify. John, thank you so very much for your perspective and your time. This I can say truthfully, and I hope this comes across to both yourself and our audience listening. This has been an absolute treat for myself to indulge in those tangents and really pick your brain.
It was much more serious conversation. I was expecting much more drivel, and relatively speaking, I'm full of drivel, and I think only you only got a drib of drivel, a drib and a drab of drivel.
Well, listen, if I've then sort of underplayed the drivel
No,
here,
no,
then it's it's
I'm glad I was wide awake to have a serious adult mature conversation.
well, listen, John, thank you so much again, and folks, we will see you next time.